And if you would like to ask questions of our panel, we have the microphone here in the center of the room for those people here. For those people online, we have a link which I will shortly post in the chat, pigeonhole.at/ICRA2022. You can also use it if you're here in person and just shy. You can ask the question online and then we will ask it of our panel. I'll kick things off with the question that I asked Bharath. I'll ask Melonee the same question. So you made a pretty compelling argument in your talk about why having probabilistic robots that kind of frequently weave behind people is not a purpose. So my question for you is, do you think there is a place in industrial robots for the techniques from probabilistic robotics?
Yeah, I will. To be clear, I wasn't saying throw it all out. I'm saying put some safeguards around it. I think that Bharath and I agree a lot in failing gracefully, putting well understood state machines around it, and then improving the determinism of the probabilistic outcomes. So one of the things that we've done is we've used a whole bunch of heuristics to make them less probabilistic and more deterministic. So instead of coming to a navigation situation in which it's like, well, anything goes, it has a heuristic that biases it preferentially. And it's configurable in our case, for example, because we do mobile robots for countries that have left or right bias, right? In the United States and other regions where people drive on the right side of the road, all of our robots drive on the right side of the road because they operate in environments with forklifts and they drive on the right side of the road. And when you go to Australia or other regions where they drive on the left side of the road, it's really good for the robots to do that, or else they look really dumb. And the other thing is like the other challenge that we see with probabilistic robotics, and one of the reasons to create these like heuristics that help make the behavior more deterministic, is robots are so greedy with their usage of space. Like they're like, free space, I'll drive in the middle of it. No one likes that. People don't even do that. Why should robots do that? And so I'm not saying that we should throw everything out. What I'm saying is that we need to make systems that behave more the way we would prefer them to behave, be less greedy, be more optimal, and be more deterministic. Because the fact of the matter is as he was saying, like the other downside of all of this is safety. Like a robot making a bad decision, let's say it's getting mislocalized, but it doesn't know it's mislocalized. Okay, so that's already a bad situation, as we were saying. It's confident that it's wrong, right? And so now you've got a robot that's wrong, it's wandering around, and in the worst case scenario, someone has left a dock door open and the robot drives off that dock door and onto a person and kills him. And that's a bad outcome. Now, we put safeguards around that, right? We tell customers they have to put barriers up and things like that, but still, that is not a failing graceful system. You're basically trusting everyone to do the right things for the system to fail safely. And so these are the things that when you look at what we have to do in production is we have to put these, I guess, graceful failures into our system so that the robots aren't as confident in their wrongness as we know they can be.
Maybe just to add a point, to what Melonee was saying is, not only is it important and critical for your company to survive that your robots be safe, you could also be doing a disservice to the entire industry. Not everyone has a Twitter account where they can have their vehicles kill people and then just go off and increase their valuation. It doesn't work like that.
You're not referring to anyone specific?
No, I don't know. Just general people. I'm not qualified roboticists, obviously. So a damage can set us back by a few years to put robots on the field, because then regulators are going to step in and just be like, nah, we're not sure about this. We had these data points. So it's better to be safe than sorry. Was that move fast and break things? There are some things you can break and some things you shouldn't break, like, democracy, people, stuff like that.
So if I could riff off of that, what keeps each of you up at night trying to interact with customers?
Do you want my real answer?
Yeah.
Salespeople. And I think all of us uniformly feel that way because they have a tendency to sell make believe, and then we have to go make it believable. That's like an existential thing that if any of you start a company, you will find that on day one is that what you think you're building and what you know you're building and what your sales team thinks you're building and knows you're building are two totally different things. And so you can end up in a situation where you get to a customer and they're like, the robot knows everything and flies. And you're like, wait, we make mobile robots. And so you can find yourself in a situation, but I would say that the other thing that keeps me up is just building a usable product. Like, I think that it's a very difficult thing to do to make the technology that we are building today very usable because most of our end users are people who are terrified of computers and web browsers. I mean, can you imagine them dealing with robots? But that's who we have to sell to, and that's who uses our product on a day-to-day basis, or at least some of us. Anyone who's selling robots in the warehousing.
Oh, sorry, go.
So I live in persistent fear of supply chain. The worst thing is to sell 0 of something. The second worst thing is to sell 1,000, particularly with no intermediate between the two. And we've done some math. You know, there's 26 degrees of freedom on digit V3. And so if you take 26 and let's say it's a relatively modest commercial order for 1,000 robots, now you're building 26,000 actuator assemblies. And unless you stop to ask yourself the question, are there 26,000 motors in the world, the entire world, at any price for me to buy, then you might not catch the fact that there aren't. And so we're starting the supply chain management process for the factory that we're building digits in now, even though we're still several years out from full mass production. And the shenanigans of the global economy over the last 2 years, I would say, definitely caused me to wonder whether the parts will be there to build robots at the scale that we're going to need to.
I'll probably follow up on one thing Melonee said is I'm also, sleepless because of salespeople, not because of what they do, but I think there's also a little bit of disservice and hype around what AI and ML capabilities are. And people believe it can do a lot of things and they expect the same thing from our robotic systems to do, which they're nowhere close. Because I think they miss the idea behind in one system, especially if it's on a phone, you're interacting with the device. It's a passive device, so you can control the input that goes in. A robot moving in an environment is you can't control the input that comes in. You're just exposed to whatever the world throws at you. And these are very different domains, but somehow they've been painted as one thing. The second thing that keeps me alive, at least I'm not alive, but sort of awake, alive too, because it pays my bills. In my line of work is when you take industries which are super inefficient and you're trying to optimize in there, there's a reason they're inefficient because things are unpredictable. So, I might lie, I think you might relate a little bit to it. There's a sales cycle that you can't predict. You think the project starts in 4 months, it'll be 6, it'll be 18, then suddenly it gets canceled. And then you have to line up projects. There's a lot of things that go into that. And all of this is you engineer for one solution to make one client happy. And that client has decided that they're going to delay things by 8 months. So suddenly you need to make another client happy. So these are practical engineering things. And how does that translate to the work you do as a roboticist? Modular, simple components that can be quickly flipped and moved. If you have complex engineered systems, the moment you touch them, they fall apart. You won't be able to iterate that fast. You should be able to iterate really fast.
Yes, so I think I have a different set of concerns because we deal with these kind of large corporate companies who are very, very sophisticated, but also have a lot of needs. And so I guess 2 things keep me awake at night. One of them is global events, because the longer the time it takes you from getting to from having an idea to, I don't know, listing, the more you are exposed to random stuff happening in the world, like COVID, which can just, make your life very difficult if you need to raise money or something like that. So I would like there to be less history happening, please. the other thing is because we deal with these very large sophisticated clients, you know, that they will say, okay, fine, you can deploy on our factory floor. If you can meet these, you know, 14 things that we ask of you, and each one of them is very detailed and complicated. And our engineers have hit them all out of the park, one after the other. But it's every time that question comes up, it's like, okay, we've got to get this right, and it's a sequence of things you have to get right, and you have to get them all right. It's like the multiplication of all these things to get a client that big. So that is the thing that stresses me out, is getting everything right enough to be able to go into someone else's factory.
I second the fear of salespeople. The thing that I've found very interesting is that oftentimes our customers are actually more sophisticated about the limitations of what can be done than our salespeople are. That what they desperately want us to do is to push back against what can and can't be done so they can design their processes right. But our salespeople will short circuit that in the desire to sort of close the deal. So that's fear number one. Fear number two, I think we consistently underestimate how much friction there is around implementations. That and our businesses are growing quite rapidly, but you run into these roadblocks in terms of how fast customers can absorb your product. You even you win a big customer and it's like, hey, it's gonna be great, but it's just as much effort to go from facility 1 to facility 2, from workflow 1 to workflow 2, and none of you in academia can have any concept of how badly people treat robots. There's there is real live animosity for no reason, and it's almost like the Stanford prisoner experiment. You know, like there are no repercussions for being mean to a robot, and so we constantly underestimate how creatively people will get in the way of our product.
Well, one more addendum. The other thing that keeps me up at night is another goddamn YouTube video that is completely unrealistic. Oh my God, stop it. Literally stop it. Like, just don't. Put how many 8x it is, 20x, 32x, and how many times it ran repeatedly, please. And how many times it took to get to that video.
Oh, I love, I hate the Boston Dynamics video, but I love the outtakes.
Yeah.
You know, all those stumbling and
I know you heard it.
No, but it's the things we're trying to do are things that work 1,000 times a day perfectly.
Yeah.
And the impression that people have of what robots can do from videos and other things are not that.
Yeah.
It's just it's you just, Chris knows the real world's tough.
Many of our customers have service level agreements that require 99.98% uptime. And if we don't meet that, we get a charge back. So do not be confused.
I have a point and a
Somebody's
question.
trying to ask a question.
We did a lot of work. I mean, not we, but as a, what do you call it? Research group or academic discipline, in putting manufacturing robots out where the key, metric for success was mean time between failures. When did that go out of the window when we're in this new wave of robotics? Like, we don't seem to care about mean time between failures, because it seems to be mean time between failures is every second. And when did that go out of the window? Like, why do we not prioritize that? I very rarely see papers. One thing I still do is review papers, and I don't see that metric anywhere on any paper. It's like, oh, this fails X number of times when run for this long. I never see it. It's mostly, oh, at 99% accuracy in placing this task and this task and that task, but there's no mean time between failures. But if you want to deploy a reliable system, that's the definition of reliability. Why is it not there?
Okay, please ask your question.
So a lot of you talk about what sales people go off and sell, not negative, but you don't need it at all. And I'm sure at some point, some engineering person will end up with that meeting and like, what are you talking about? We don't even use those kinds of capabilities. So what's your advice, or how do you take those kinds of situations where expectation is something else, what you're doing is something totally different, and how do you bring the expectation to what we can do today or in the next 6 to 8 months based on the projects that come to you from different customers? Thanks.
Honestly, it depends on where you catch it. So typically in those situations where something is sold and there's a big gap or disparity between what was sold and what you're capable of doing, is it depends on where you catch it in the sales process and whether it's recoverable and whether you think that it's a lot of trade-offs, because the customer is very big and their ask is not too bad and you're not that far from achieving it, then you end up going back and resetting expectations and things like that. Sometimes if the gap is very large, you actually walk away from the customer. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. But startups have a problem very early on, typically saying no. And it took me a while to figure this out. But once we did, we became a lot more successful. The saying no is a good thing. Well, at least I believe it is. I don't know if that's what you guys learned.
It makes the customer want you more. No, it's absolutely true that if you have the backbone to stand up to your customer, they start to solve problems that they're trying to put on you. And I think that's a real key for us, is trying to pick the problems. Because no robots are perfect, and but customers want them for a reason. And I was really fascinated by your paper because you're talking about sort of traditional industrial robotics, making that work better. Our business model is really on the lunatic fringe of what you're talking about, that we measure our market by how many people in the world are doing that thing. You know, whether it's moving stuff around a warehouse or working in a factory, and figuring that the cost of those people is going to go up, 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 up. So we're constantly looking at where the edge is and what can we do and what can't we do, and making good decisions about that is really key to the whole business model.
Can I just say, so actually I kind of love my salespeople, sorry, and they do great. I guess the things that we've adopted that I think have made them somewhat successful is they're all trained on the software. So they go through a training thing where they learn to use the software, they build some stuff with it. And then usually there's an engineer on the sales call. So we have application engineers who build stuff with it every day, who sit on the sales call. And then additionally, the way that we structure contracts is that there's a POC, which is typically done in software first. The POC's got a gate where we have to make some performance increase or something like that attached to the simulated thing. And so everyone knows that if we don't make that, then we don't get through to the next thing. And that kind of structure has really made that's the reason that I'm not worried about that. Of course, we're a special case, as you said. We're dealing with a well understood entrenched industry that we're upgrading, and we consciously decided to do that versus a thing that's not automated that we're going to automate next, which is somewhere we're going to get, but it's not where we're focused now. Trade-offs there are a bit different, and it's easier in some sense to deal with the kind of proof of concept.
Yeah, so I can second that. We actually started working with our largest customer about 3 years ago, and actually had them bring their wish list to us and then down selected out of it. And I'll also second the say no a lot. We say no to anybody who can't buy 100 robots. It's just not worth the engineering time. In an environment, for anybody who's a student on the job market, I'm sure you know what you'll likely get paid these days. And you just can't justify the engineering time for a customization unless someone's buying, very large quantity to do that. Now, I would say we do take the customer feedback seriously. We've allowed them to drive the area that we're in. Now, I'm sure people caught the Ford slide that I had up there, which was kind of our unveiling of the original Digit. 3 years ago. Well, there's a reason that I'm not talking about doing last mile delivery now, which is it ended up being better from a safety profile and from a market size to actually do in-warehouse operations. And so we learned that lesson from the customer rather than proactively. But yeah, say no a lot and be careful what you're getting into.
Maybe kind of a point midway in between is whether you love your salespeople or don't love your salespeople comes down to where you are in your sales cycle and the sales process. Initially, it's a good thing for them to go out because you need to validate your product. You have to throw it out there. Someone has to break it and find out where it works. There's a chance that you will burn a few customers because of that, because you realize that you just picked out the wrong market for something. Eventually, your salespeople learn, and when the sales cycle is refined, they'll be able to do a better sale. And most, at least the industry applications that we're involved in, it's all about integrating into their workflow. Nobody likes something that sits in a unicorn by itself. And that is the education and where the salespeople come in and they have a humongous impact. Like, I would not hate my salespeople because they pay our bills. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't exist as a company. They do this, but at the same time, did they go ahead at the early stage of the company and sell things that were realistically not feasible? And we didn't know they were feasible till the problem came to us. It's like, it was not easy to assess at the get-go that, oh, we can do this and we cannot. We get the problem and go like, yeah, the real world is very hard. So let's not take this on. Let's try something else. So it's very tricky on where you are in sales cycle, how they push, how they don't push. And also, like someone was mentioning, George was mentioning, they have to be trained. Initially, it's a free-for-all, and then you slowly train them once you know you have established a very good sales cycle.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing that you'll see across all of the panelists here is we all are in different market maturity cycles, product maturity cycles, and just technology maturity cycles. And so, like, you know, as George pointed out, like, he's working in a very mature market. And so there's a lot more things that are very much better understood, like him simulating his systems, he can be very accurate in that. Whereas today, there's a lot of tools that don't work well for simulating our environments. And so it's very hard to build these kind of models. And so we're more reliant on the sales team and the sales engineers as compared to like a directly data-driven sales model, for example. And so I think that one of the things that you're seeing in the disparity between our answers is those differences in the maturity cycle of each of the companies, the product, the vertical, the technology, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the only thing that's in common is it's all robotics, right? That, I mean, Universal Robots is, 10 to 15,000 robots a year sold through 400 different distributors. So very little direct control over how it's positioned. At the other end, we have, it's a much more involved sales cycle towards a full system solution. So I think there isn't one size fits all, but trying to match customer expectation with what products can actually do kind of cuts across all of that, whether it's one of 10,000 robots or one of an in-depth solution.
I had a question. So Bharath there mentioned how there's a disparity between the metrics that are sometimes used in research papers, such as one of them, the mean time between errors lacking. I'm curious if you could touch on some of the evaluations or experiments, the plots, or anything else that you really would want to see in the paper that would make you go, oh, that would work. Maybe we should give that a go. Or the exact opposite of that is that, no, this is a red flag.
I wish there was one generic answer for that question, and there isn't, because at least the way we operate, and I'm guessing most companies do, we don't look at the research paper and absorb it for all it is. We probably take out bits and pieces and components from it that we find interesting. So there might be a bit of piece, like, let's take an ML paper, for instance. It might be about some network, blah, blah, blah. I would be really just interested in, oh, that's a nice numerical optimization technique they've used. It will save us so much compute. Let's just take that idea. The rest of the paper, amazing, it can stay at nits. And this is the way you operate. So it comes down to particular ideas that we pick from particular papers, but then that has to be communicated, and you need to understand what your contribution is. I think where the contributions and the way they're communicated is more for the paper getting accepted. I think like George can speak to this in greater detail as an academic is accuracy, great. No one really cares about. It's about worst case performance, because worst case performance is what will make you lose the business. So there are those metrics that we care about, like the mean time between failure, all of this, like mean time between failure makes sense for hardware systems. If they don't have direct impact, like SaaS-based software, where it's not doing a mission critical thing, that is not becoming a metric anymore. It might be something else. So I want to tell you there's one answer for this question, but maybe the problem you raised that question is the solution you're developing, focus it on the industry where it might be used and find out what they care about. And that's probably what you should report in the paper.
I would say that in some areas there are well understood things that you could be looking at. Let's look at mapping, for example. With mapping, you could look at how likely it is to do any loop closure on a set of data, right? You can look at what's the largest scale map it can actually reproduce a map for. Because if you look at a lot of the, let's look at mapping, for example, like people make mapping algorithms that are like, yay, we made a map and we can do a map in a 5,000 square foot environment. Great, like a Turtlebot can do a map in a 5,000 square foot environment, and it's like the worst robot possible. And so it's like, yippee, we proved that even the worst robot in the world can build a map. But that's actually, you know, what we're talking about in that field is how big can we go? How long does it take computationally? How does the computation scale? Like those are things that, if anything, we're interested in. The problem is I agree with you that really half the time we're doing like a literature review and we're like, okay, what's the most interesting thing we read that we can take? Dump the rest of this in the garbage can because it's cute, but not useful. And I'm sorry, that really probably hurts, but that's kind of how research is used in the industrial corporate environment. I mean, we have to make progress and move on. And the problem is a lot of times we can't reproduce even what you put in your paper. Like hell, you can't even reproduce what is in the probabilistic robotics book for probabilistic robotics. I actually had a conversation with Dieter the other day. AMCL has a massive bug in it. It does. I can find the line and send you the thing on it. In which they just did a fractional sum across some of the inputs because no one really knew how to make it actually work. If they followed what was in the probabilistic robotics book, it doesn't converge, guys. So it doesn't. The thing that everyone takes as canon doesn't converge in real life, and the code that you all use does something totally different. It literally does that. And so I think it's important to realize that like the research doesn't always map to reality, and to make it work, we just make it work. And so unfortunately, a lot of things that are in research end up almost cannibalized into corporate products.
Well, I can say, you know, based on your comment about power, we run into that with our stuff. It's even more extreme than, you know, AGV level thing. So Digit, as an example, has a 1 kilowatt hour battery pack on it, has about a 3-hour operating life, so around 300 watts of power steady state. Half of that's compute, and half of it's compute because one of our control threads needs blistering single thread performance on it. So we have this crazy, you know, i7 overclocked to run that. But you know, if you want a metric about how applicable your algorithms are, tell me how many watts it requires on a real processor that can actually be installed into a real piece of hardware, and then we'll use it. You know, as an example, the parasitic power loss on our amplifiers that we use is about 100 watts steady state. So a third of the power budget on the robot is just keeping the motors alive, doing nothing but alive. Another third is the compute generally, and then only the remaining third is able to like make the robot go and do anything useful. So if we have something that requires, you know, some sort of crazy GPU that pulls, you know, 900 watts steady state, that would exceed the rest of the robot by a factor of 3. We can't use it. And so, you know, if you want an initial proxy, number of watts is a good proxy to use.
Can I I want to expand the question a little bit. So, because I don't generally read a single paper and then take a thing from it, even though I'm an academic mostly. Even in real time, it's kind of not the right way to think about research. Okay, so the way to think about research is this giant funnel. Okay, where you all, if you're in a research lab, especially if you're federally funded, your job is not to do useful stuff. Our job is to do useful stuff. Your job is to come up with cool ideas with the expectation that they will not be useful for 15 years, right? That's what federal funding is for. That's why it's socialized. It's socialized because like no one knows what crazy ideas someone has now that's going to be useful, some number of years from now, right? Like no one was, no corporation was funding the Reverend Bayes when he was, writing down this equation, right? Okay, he was just like an obsessive nerd writing down some math that he thought was cool. And so one way to think about academia is that you obsessive nerds, and I'm also an obsessive nerd, so we're all in it together. We just come up with cool ideas that we think are cool, and maybe they're driven by useful, but we have to accept that they're not gonna be useful soon. Okay, they're gonna be interesting, they're gonna expand the conversation, and then over time, that big funnel of cool ideas, which mostly don't work and can't be taken and put into a thing, are gonna slowly crystallize. And like one way to get them to crystallize is to say 5 or 10 years after they were written in the literature, you get a textbook like probabilistic robotics, which sort of puts them in kind of teachable shape to someone. Okay, so that's like one stage of stuff. But even that's not, as we've seen, it's not necessarily enough to make them all the way useful. That's useful enough to put into an R&D group, which is going to turn them into a product, right? So you should think of that pipeline as 10 or 15 years. And I don't ever pick up a single paper. I will pick up a trend. It'll be like, hey, this class of methods on average across these many papers seems to perform reasonably well, seems to be productive. It's worth me taking 3 of our PhDs to do a reading group of them. And what they implement will be none of those individual papers. It will be some lesson drawn from them. And sometimes we discovered that the technology is just broken. And that's like life, right? Like research is wasteful. Of course it is, because nobody knows what's going to work. But sometimes it turns out that you can take these 7 broken things together. You can extract the core idea. You can build a thing that's robust. And then it might take you 5 years to make that thing robust, right? But that's kind of not, that's kind of what should live in an R&D group at a company. And then what's happening in robotics and startups at the moment is we are kind of shortcutting that process because we're so excited to make this stuff real that we're leaping this traditional R&D process, which is great. And there's a lot of reward in that. If you can make it work, it's wonderful. But really don't expect any individual paper to, and I write papers for a living. I don't take any individual paper that seriously. It's just not gonna, it's just part of a, it's like a particle, a giant particle filter. Like over time, I'm gonna form an impression of what I think roughly works. And when the story becomes clear enough, then we try and turn it into something nice. Does that make sense? And I think it squares with what Melonee was saying, but maybe from the more friendly to academia side.
Well, yeah, I wanted to add, that's why I threw the slide up about, the long history of stuff that is in Jonathan's career. He started working on this in 1997. So, a quarter century ago now. And the AMASC, which, I was joking about, but in all seriousness is why we're here or why I'm here, was from 19 years ago. So we had interns who were, in diapers or not born yet when that robot was made, which is a little humbling. I'm old, but I'm not that old. So just be aware of the long arc here with your work. And I, 100% agree. Don't have the test standard that your stuff be useful. That's not the point of it. The point of it is to see a whole field of knowledge. It's the same thing that people were doing in the early 90s with NavLab. Why is Chuck Thorpe famous? Because he was doing, early self-driving stuff where people didn't call it that back then. So, don't apply the standard that you have to be directly useful.
But hang on, just
Go for it.
no, I come from a different industry, 35 years in semiconductor test, and I witnessed a remarkable bifurcation between academic research and anything useful for industry. And I would really, I would aspire to be able to give people hints about what research would be useful. And it sounds like you're just willing to allow it to be probabilistic. Let them do whatever they want, and then we'll pick out particles and life. I feel like we can do better than that as an industry.
So I don't think we can do better than that as a civilization.
Okay.
I think if, I don't know, man, my work is built on so many random mathematicians who spent years in a cupboard or something, writing down math frantically between the real jobs. And it was never useful to them. It was never useful to anyone they knew
Well,
or
but that
generations
just
later.
gets us into the right warehouse.
But I
So
would
they
say,
get it
I
like-
would say that open source has been that middle ground, though.
Okay,
Let's be clear. I mean, if you look at it, the thing that bridged the gap in the last decade and accelerated a lot of things has been open source. ROS builds that bridge of trying to make practical application out of the research and enabled some of the research to even be explored, because one of the problems is the barrier to entry for corporations even looking at research is time and energy. The thing about many researchers putting their research up on GitHub and making it a ROS package has enabled us to at least try it out and see if it works. And so that would be the other thing I would say to you is if you're going to do your research, make the source code available. Make sure in your paper you put a link to the tag in your repository of what check-in is that paper, so that we can at least look at it and see if it's viable. Now, make sure you have a good license on it because it'll die in LGBL land. I would say, and your point about licensing is so on target. I would say that if anything, open source has been the bridge these days. It's not great. I'm more in your camp where it's like, oh my God, stop being particles and butterflies and build something. But I'm just a cynical, jaded, I did research at Willow Garage for 10 years and all I got was a turtle bot.
I mean,
Well, I mean, I made it, but anyway.
I have, competing views in this. The first thing, maybe the Bayes thing, I don't entirely agree. I think he was actually trying to solve a practical problem. Reverend Bayes was trying to estimate the probability of, because it was, I forget what it was, but it was tied to a practical problem.
Gambling.
Okay, yeah,
I
gambling.
think.
And so
It's
it was,
always gambling.
it was a practical problem. And I think this is a more philosophical question. Are we a science or are we an engineering discipline? Because I think this is where it comes into, if you're science, go out there and do really out there stuff, which is sometimes you see papers where I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I don't care if it has no practical application. It's awesome because it's like George was talking about, that big bucket of ideas, something comes out of it. 90% of the papers are masquerading as practical applications when they're incremental research where they're not adding real value. Either build something functioning as an engineer that actually works, or go out there, take a risk and do something really crazy. The problem is I feel like there's this big bucket in between of, I hate to use the word, but nonsense, where you can walk into, this is something I learned leaving graduate school and becoming, you walk into an ICRA and RSS and you're like, yeah, there was one decent idea there, or maybe two. And that is bad when there are 1,500 papers or 2,500 papers where someone goes, that's one decent idea. So either people are not taking enough risks or they're fooling themselves that the incremental changes they're making is somehow having impact where it doesn't go all the way. If you're building a system to work, make it work.
but is it that computational efficiency for biped robots is not sexy enough? Or what's the, like,
It's definitely not publishable. I mean, I'm telling you, Fetch tried to publish a whole bunch of papers at conferences like this. You know what we got? Rejected.
Yeah, it's not novel enough. I was like, it works, who cares?
That actually was 3 of the rejections we got. It works, who cares? You did engineering. That was the summation of the rejection. This is engineering work. You literally killing me, you know?
Yeah, so maybe the thought process should be, are you planning to go be an engineer in the industry or are you going to pursue an academic career? And then that will help you dictate, are you doing out there ideas or do you want to use the course of your academic training to figure out how to get things to work?
so do you want tenure or do you want to change the world?
I'll let George respond to that.
Okay, so I can tell you the trade-off I made as an academic is a very low probability of massively changing the world, right? Which is what most tenure. I mean, a tenure is like in academia you're given like a job for 40 years, and then it's like being entrusted with come up with cool ideas for 40 years, which just some of them will be okay. And in that case, you know, if you're doing it right, you take big risks and you try and do something that has a major impact, but you make peace with the fact that the probability that it happens is low. That's the trade-off that you make. So in exchange for being an academic, you get a nice salary, you get 40 years to do whatever you want, And if you really win, you do something really impactful, and 90% of people don't. Like, I don't actually think that it's avoidable that most papers don't make an impact. I was thinking about, you know, those old papers on the legged robots. I wonder if you reversed time and you went back then and you looked at all the papers written about legged robots then, because now we're doing the hindsight. We're saying, oh, look, you know, 20 years ago, someone wrote this one paper and everything happened. But if you go back to those 20 years ago, I bet you there were 20 people or 30 people trying to do that, and one line worked. And I will bet you that no one at the time could tell which one was gonna work. Right? That's why I think we need to sort of, you know, go and do creative stuff, because no one can tell, right? If we could tell, we'd just do the thing, but mostly we can't tell. And so that's why technology is the way it is, right? It's built by creative people daydreaming. It's not like if we just had a good heuristic or everyone thought more applied, we could just solve all the problems. It is just genuinely hard to come up with genuinely new stuff, like really, really intellectually, creatively new stuff. So you can decide who you want to be. It's true, and I get to have a foot in both camps. I deploying real robots at the same time as my academic research. I don't expect to be useful for decades, and I think if you expect it to be super useful immediately, you might be doing it wrong. But don't fool yourself that the second thing is not extraordinarily valuable.
So this has been a very, very interesting, exciting discussion. I've really enjoyed watching this. I'm sure everyone else here has too. So we're kind of running out of time here. I'd like to close this up with one last question on a positive note, the opposite question that James asked. So what keeps you up at night? What are you excited to get out of bed about in the morning?
Yeah, sure. So I am really excited about how few people are in the world, or especially how few people want to work in factories. Right now in the United States, there's 600,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs. Last year in the United States, there was like a total of 60,000 robots sold. I mean, it's like 10 to 1 in terms of how close we're coming to filling the gap that exists right now. And the gap is getting bigger every year. So I feel like there's just an extraordinary opportunity for us to do something really, really remarkable. But I think we have to focus in on what we can do.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two answers for each of my two lives. Or maybe they're really one answer. I mean, I get to go in on Mondays and I get to walk around this building in the Seaport area of Boston, and I get to listen to the robots whir. Right? We have all these robot arms and they're going in the background all at the same time. And I remember being a kid and you know, and turning on a sort of TV about that wide to watch kind of cartoons about robots. It's kind of wild that we live in an age where you can do this for a living and it can be a real thing. And then I get to walk into my lab and we have these robots that we hand built to do science with, and I get to do that, you know, for real. So that's kind of, it's a little nuts. Occasionally I stop and think, wait a minute, really? really? Yes, but really. And in both those cases, whether you want to be an academic or you want to build these companies, I think that the opportunity to do really creative, impactful, scientifically and technically exciting work, it's just like unparalleled in human history compared to what you have open to you now, right? You really like, it's not just that there are, you know, 1/10 as many people as robots being sold as jobs they could do. It's that there are vastly fewer robot startups that vastly fewer people with the right training in robotics than there are robot startups that could be successful, right? You really like there are like zillions of companies that could be founded that would do something valuable today, and there's way more of those opportunities than there are of you. So you are right now in an incredibly lucky position where if you want to, you can, you know, be like Tony Stark, basically, right? You can build a thing, you can invent a thing, it can change the way we live, and that's like pretty wild, I think.
Probably a very different answer. I would say the thing that gets me excited every morning is my team. You can win any championship, you can surpass or succumb to, you know, any obstacle in front of you if you're playing with the right team. I have an awesome team that gets me excited to just go up and work with them, and I think we can take on any challenge the industry throws at us. So that's what gets me excited every morning.
So 1820, 75% of the US was doing farming, and in 2020, 1.5% of the US was doing farming. Who wants to guess what the net job loss in number of employees was over that period.
So it actually went up.
0. And that's what gets me excited, is that tech gets a bad rap. It's why people abuse robots. But what it has done is improve the world in general. And I think that gets me excited. I think all of us here have the chance to contribute something meaningful to society in a field that is currently misunderstood, but is getting to be less so. And I think that impact is very exciting. Personally, I also enjoy going and hearing the robots. We're end of lifing digit V3 right now. It'll be end of life at unit number 57. And it's cool to be here from the beginning of a company that at times has struggled to have any operating robots to now having as many as we do employees on the floor at sometimes. And it's cool to see. It's something you only do at scale, and it's cool we've gotten to that point.
Well, besides not ever having to work again, because I just sold my company. The thing that gets me really excited is now that I'm part of a very large company, Zebra Technologies, I get to form an advanced robotics group, and we're going to build the next generation of Fetch. And I'm hiring. If you're looking for a job and you want to build the next generation of Fetch robotics, come find me. Give me your resume, come talk to me. Tell me what you're doing, how it's cool, and how you want to engineer some shit. Because I'm looking for a team to do it.
Okay, well, on that note, this concludes the workshop. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our speakers and our panel guests. Thank you to those who submitted abstracts, and thank you to my co-organizers. This has been a very great workshop, very informative. I really enjoyed the 2 discussions that we had today. So can we give a round of applause to our panel?